Lord Moylan, the former advisor to Boris Johnson. Lord Moylan, welcome to you. I mean, the consensus seems to be emerging that actually Richard Sharp, whatever he did wrong was inadvertent. He's acted with integrity by going in the way that he has done. Isn't this just really evidence that anyone who comes into Boris Johnson, ultimately their reputation gets contaminated?
My reputation hasn't been contaminated. I'd give you a list of at least 100 people who've worked with Boris Johnson whose reputation I know from personal knowledge hasn't been contaminated. I think that's a preposterous thing to say. This was a small administrative error. I think Mr. Sharp, whom I don't know, and of course I haven't read the report in full because it's only just been published. So with those caveats, Mr. Sharp appears to have disclosed what might be a conflict of interest to the cabinet secretary and thought that he was fulfilling the rules by doing that. It's been found that he didn't fulfill the rules by doing that. That wasn't quite enough. And very honourably, I think we've all agreed, he stood down as a result of being found to have made that modest breach. I don't actually see how this engages Boris Johnson at all, actually.
Well, it does, because Boris Johnson, it was his financial difficulties and the fact that he needed
you can go
money.
back in history. You could say, well, what was the interest? The question at issue here was, did Mr. Sharp have an interest that he should have declared to the panel? It doesn't matter what the history of that interest was. And what has been found out, what it's been said of him, is that he should have declared it. He thought he'd done that effectively. All right, muddle. And nobody thinks he was being dishonest at all. He thought he had declared it. It doesn't matter what it was. It could have been his grandmother's interest in azaleas if it was relevant to the job. I don't see why there's any need to bring Boris Johnson into this at all. The Prime Minister
you do need to bring Boris Johnson into it. This whole saga has unfolded because Boris Johnson in late 2020 needed a loan of £800,000. I mean, that's not Richard Sharp's fault.
Well, all right. As I say, you can go into the history of what led to the conflict of interest. That's not about what today's report is about. What today's report about is, did he have a conflict of interest which he should have declared? And it was found that he didn't, and he's behaved very responsibly in going, although that is, he didn't declare it, although he thought he had. And that's really, as far as I can tell, is the long and the short of this whole quite expensive report. So there was a conflict of interest, and it was to do with Boris. The idea that everybody's reputation, who's connected with Boris, is destroyed is complete nonsense, or this isn't even really a story about Boris. There are stories, there are things you might want to ask about Boris and finances. I don't know the answers to them. They've got nothing to do with Richard Sharp or the BBC.
Well, Lord Moylan, apologies for any imputation on that suggested that your reputation was tarnished.
Well, that's very kind. I mean, you seem to be suggesting straight off that my reputation had been tarnished. Why would you have me on your show if I had such a bad reputation?
No, absolutely not. We're not implying there's been any damage, but it is a fact nonetheless that a lot of people who do come into Boris Johnson and to contact with him, their reputation ends up being damaged in some way. And Richard Sharp is really the latest example of that.
Well, maybe that's because there are people in Britain who want to eradicate Boris Johnson's memory, and they go for people near him. Very much as you have these attacks on Trump at the moment in America. I'm not saying there's any similarity between Trump and Boris, because 5 minutes intelligent reflection shows that there isn't. But it's simply a technique that seems to be growing, particularly on the left, is to use courts and smears and so on to keep going at somebody even after they've stood down.
Lord Moylan, before I let you go, I mean, this really does appear to be the job from hell. I mean, you're in the political spotlight throughout. Who on earth would want this job? Who on earth would want to succeed Richard Sharp?
I think it's a really, really good question. And I don't think it's just BBC jobs. I think these high-profile chairmanships, where you get somebody who has real business experience, who doesn't come from a political background, who isn't used to being abused on Twitter the whole time and whatever, but they come out of a world of business and finance experience, and they have a lot to give in these roles. And then they discover the sort of battering they get and the publicity they've been subjected to. not just Richard Sharp. I think of other people. There was the man who was chairing the Environment Agency at the time of the flooding in the Somerset Levels, whose reputation was totally trashed because he was on his Christmas holiday. He was a very senior and significant engineer who'd taken that job. I think it's really difficult to persuade people to do it because of the potential for exposure and having your whole family laughed at and having your reputation ridiculed, not because you've done a bad job, but because of something related to a headline. You never dare take a holiday because if something goes wrong and you're photographed on a beach, you're sort of trashed. So I think it really is difficult. But I think it's really important for the BBC to have somebody as chairman who is their friend in government. You know, people write about this as if a conservative comes in anywhere into the ambit of the BBC administration, they're there as a sort of Attila the Hun coming to destroy it, whereas nearly all of them actually are there to be the BBC's, they turn out to be the BBC's friend at the heart of government. And if you cut yourself off completely into a wholly political sphere, you won't have any friends at the heart of government.
Yeah. Lord Moylan, greatly appreciate you joining me this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian.